Well-placed confidence or misplaced optimism, that is the question ahead of this weekend's two-day national convention in Pretoria. Now, while the organising committee of the convention says it's all systems go for the gathering, a number of developments indicate levels of distrust about the process intended to reset the future agenda of the country. Among others, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, which has since pulled out of the preparatory task team, has raised renewed concerns around the funding model of the national dialogue. Joining us to discuss the two-day national convention is political analyst Lukhona Mnguni. Good afternoon, Lukhona. Thank you very much for joining us on the program.
Always a pleasure talking to you. Good afternoon.
No, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, before we get to the convention itself, I just want to get your views on the current developments around the Ehaling versus minibus taxi standoff that we're seeing, because it's quite problematic. Yesterday, an Ehaling driver died. We've just had a recent development that we've got a minibus taxi that has now been torched in Soweto, and of course there are now renewed fears of some sort of retaliation between these two sectors. But when listening to the Ehaling drivers or operators, they have been requesting for numerous times now, requesting that they be regulated. But it seems government has been moving very slowly in ensuring that they are onboarded. This industry is regulated so that they can work alongside the taxi bus industry. What do you make of just that, or inability to fast track or move at a greater pace to regulate this space?
But it's also just good evidence of the absence of the rule of law and the disintegration of law enforcement in our country to a large extent. Yes, I mean, the e-hailing industry has been asking for serious regulatory measures to be protected, not just only from the minibus taxis, but also to be protected from the proverbial, before e-hailing, you'll remember there used to be taxis that you could call. The meter taxis. And there was a huge standoff. I mean, in some areas, if you go, for example, around the Gautrain in Hatfield, you probably can't call an e-hail, you can't e-hail around because the meter taxis sort of block, harass people and do all of these things. But again, it's, I mean, absence of regulation, but also I just think absence of acceptance of the rule of law, allowing competition and, you know, people improving their own efficiencies in their line of work and their businesses, because there is enough space for all of these industries to coexist. We know that, you know, the taxi industry is bedeviled a lot by, you know, taxi violence and all of sort of tensions for routes and all of these things. And now the e-hailers find themselves, you know, being seen as though they are contesting certain terrain. But I mean, people have a choice, a right to choose how they want to be ferried from point A to B.
Especially when you think of the grandmothers in Soweto. I mean, in the suburbs, everybody has that choice where you can buy groceries and then you have the Uber taxi leaving you at your doorstep. Why would a grandmother who wants to go to the mall not be able to then take their groceries straight to the doorstep? Because here, if you're taking an ordinary taxi, it doesn't go into the routes and ensures that you're actually at your doorstep if you're 75.
No, I mean, it's, again, I mean, the taxi industry has been allowed to, you know, provide leadership on its own without, you know, local police, whether it's your JMPD in the sense of Soweto, you know, your Johannesburg Metropolitan, you know, police departments coming and making sure that, you know, people are allowed to exercise their rights and freedoms to the extent that they wish to. And it's really about how violence is utilized as a mechanism to coerce, to parcel out territory, and to impose themselves on people. And if you go to a number of, you know, towns, particularly rural towns, you'll find, you know, taxis don't want you to hitchhike, for example. And people have had to go to magistrate courts for taxi associations to be told that people actually can decide how they want to travel, and you can't impose yourself like that. I mean, there was a school in Durban I visited some years ago, and the taxis would actually stand at the entrance of, you know, the school to check if you had more than one child in your private vehicle. They would say, prove that these kids are connected to you and that you are not, you know, making money by ferrying a number of children. So there is a thing that has to be spoken about that industry. Regulations will only achieve half the problem. The problem here is the enforcement of the rule of law and the respect for the rule of law and the respect for people's ability to choose.
Quite interesting. And then to the two-day convention, because probably these are some of the issues that will arise, because you were hearing there, Stella Ndabeni, also wanting that whether it's small businesses, even the industry such as the taxi association are invited to make their contributions, because they also want to be regulated, because they constantly say that they resort to self-help because there's no greater regulation or enforcement, if you will. But if we get to the two-day convention itself, when speaking to the CEO of the Desmond Tutu Foundation last week, their reasons for pulling out were, among others, the fear of government possibly usurping the power of citizens to control this process. They were saying that here, even though government may be funding this process, they believe that that could potentially usurp the ability of this to be a legitimately citizen-led program where even citizens want to sit and discuss governance. So now you've got government, they want them that at the very least make sure that it's funding, but you cannot be fully involved. What do you make of just that argument and what we're seeing now?
It's politics. There's a lot of ego and personalities also involved in this process. I've had the opportunity to chat to some of, the foundations over the last, say, 10 months. And I mean, it was always clear to me that they are going to run themselves into a problem. And the first problem was insisting that it is the president who must make the charge and call for a national dialogue. It ought to have not been the president. The second was to rely then on government funding and then insist that the secretariat be held by NEDLAC. Now, NEDLAC is a statutory body, of course, and they are bound by, the PFMA, or Public Finance Management Act, and so on, which now everybody is now going around and saying there's a problem with procurement and so on. I mean, the venue is free. Of course, other things will have to be paid for in terms of travel, accommodation, and so on. But the truth is that here we are seeing a political fight between the foundations and government in terms of control over the process. And I think what has now since happened, I mean, if you see also after Forum Solidarity saying they are pulling out and so on, is that it now reduces this to just a dialogue and not a national dialogue. Because a national dialogue should have all the touch points of society, should have representation of as many people.
But even in this first phase? Because the Thabo Mbeki Foundation was even saying that in this first phase, we also wanted greater stakeholder engagement. That it cannot just be, even if it's preparatory, as the president said, that it's just laying the groundwork. We don't need everyone. They were saying everyone must be there.
No, absolutely. And there's a mischief to try and reduce the national convention that's going to take over 2 days to just a mere kickstart of the national dialogue. Of course, there's going to be numerous engagements across society in different, communities and so on, and across sectors. But the truth is that the national convention sets the tone of the seriousness and importance of that. And I don't think that what has happened and the fallouts that we have seen over time, I mean, political parties also saying, I mean, Action SA coming out saying they'll send 2 senior members of parliament on a watching brief, but they will not participate as a party. The Democratic Alliance was, admonished when it said it's pulling out of the national dialogue. And that exchange between former President Thabo Mbeki and John Steenhuisen, the leader of the DA. And now, now former President Mbeki is exactly in the same position that, Steenhuisen is in. And I think, but it's characteristic of where our country is. There's an absence of a center to gravitate towards, and I call it the absence of elders in the room called South Africa. So everybody is placing their ego, their personalities on the line, and so on. It's hard to make people find each other and one another, and you can only have a serious national dialogue that makes us be in one room as South Africans from different persuasions and to speak truth to power in the presence of one another and make the trade-offs that are necessary. And now when you start seeing serious blocks of society pulling out, of course you still have the eminent persons group as well as part of that dialogue. They also want more direction and more authority over the process, and it seems as if the consensus now is to say give them a much more prominent role rather than being ambassadors of the national dialogue, but they become custodians.
Because it's their own brands, honestly, on the line in this instance, and many are also raising concerns about this probably being an elitist conversation, which is quite problematic on its own if many people, ordinary citizens, might feel they might not be involved.